Mr. President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you again and to represent the Gambia in this significant case. This case is about Myanmar's acts of genocide against the Rohingya group. As I will explain, there can be no doubt that the Rohingya are a protected group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Myanmar's refusal to recognize them as such, or to even use the term Rohingya, is entirely without effect or relevance. I begin my presentation by providing an overview of the relevant geography, demography, and history of northern Rakhine State, the area where the Rohingya have mostly lived, or at least where they lived before Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations. I will then address the evidence that establishes the Rohingya to be an ethnical, religious, and/or racial group within the meaning of the Genocide Convention. On the screen is figure 1.1 from the Gambia's memorial. This is a map showing the location of Rakhine State outlined in red. This is the westernmost state of Myanmar with a coastline that runs along the Bay of Bengal. Zooming in, you can see more clearly that Sittwe, the capital of Rakhine State, is depicted on the map with a small circled black dot. Most of the acts of genocide during the so-called clearance operations that we focus on in this case occurred in the 3 townships northwest of Sittwe. Those townships, Buthidong, Mongdaw, and Rathidong, are depicted in figure 1.2 from the memorial, which you can see on your screens. Townships are an administrative unit of local governance in Myanmar. They are made up of towns and villages. The villages are grouped into village tracts. Numerous specific villages where clearance operations occurred are also depicted on this map. These townships are predominantly rural agrarian communities with populations spread out among hundreds of villages across these lands. The houses are mostly made of bamboo, with roofs made of palm leaves. There are no major urban population centers in this part of northern Rakhine State. The manner in which the Rohingya population was situated geographically in small villages rather than large urban centers is a key factor for the court's understanding of that part of the Rohingya group targeted by Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations. The total population of Rakhine State, as estimated by Myanmar's 2014 census, is 3.19 million. This includes people from many different ethnic groups, including Rakhine, Rohingya, Mro, Kaman, Dainet, Chin, and others. Around 1.1 million people out of that figure were, quote, unenumerated. This is because Myanmar reneged on its explicit commitment to allow the Rohingya to self-identify as such in that census. Those wishing to self-identify as Rohingya were not allowed to formally participate, but the 3.19 million figure includes that estimated unenumerated population. The population of Rohingya in all of Rakhine State, including in the state capital Sittwe, was estimated to be around 1.1 to 1.4 million pre-clearance operations. The largest Rohingya population centers were in the principal towns in Mongdaw, Buthidong, and Rathidong townships. But in many of the villages, the populations were around a few hundred people. Over 700,000 Rohingya fled the clearance operations in 2017 and took refuge in Bangladesh. In terms of the Rohingya population, specifically in each of Buthidong, Mongdo, and Rathadong townships, those numbers are less certain. Before the clearance operations, the Rohingya made up around 80 to 90% of the population of these 3 townships, with Rakhine making up most of the rest of the population. According to data from Myanmar's 2014 census, Buthadong Township had a population of around 206,000 people, Mongdo some 112,000 people, and Rathadong around 140,000 people. It is unclear to what extent, if any at all, these figures include the unenumerated population. Mr. President, members of the court, for centuries, the Rohingya have called Rakhine State, or Arakan, their home. The Rohingya report, authored by Francis Wade for the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which we also refer to as the IIMM, notes that Muslims have been present in what is now Rakhine State since at least the 9th century, when Muslim seafarers set up trading posts along the coasts. There is additional compelling evidence that the Rohingya have lived in present-day Rakhine State for centuries and have called themselves Rohingya. A 1799 British colonial ethnography published by Dr. Francis Buchanan noted that, quote, the Mohammedans who have long settled in Arakan and who call themselves Rohingya, or natives of Arakan, end quote, speak their own dialect. An 1811 article in the British Classical Journal identified Rohingya as one of 3 languages spoken in the Burma Empire. The collection of languages published in 1815 by German professor J.S. Vader included an entry for Rohingya, noting the existence of the Rohingya ethnic group and its distinct language. Myanmar argues that there are no other similar historical sources that refer to the Rohingya as such. This fails to refute the fact that these specific sources did exactly that. At a minimum, these sources document the fact that the Rohingya referred to themselves as such going all the way back to the end of the 18th century. Myanmar also argues that most of this population immigrated to Myanmar during the British colonial period, which began in the mid-19th century. While it may be the case that some populations moved into this region over time, the historical record makes clear that the Rohingya had been present as a group in this region for 3 centuries. The historical record also shows that after Burma's independence in 1948, its political and military leaders recognized the Rohingya as a distinct ethnic group. The first Prime Minister, U Nu, made the following statement in a 1954 radio address. Quote, "The people living in Mongdo and Buthadong regions are our nationals, our brethren. They are called Rohingyas. They are one of the same par in status of nationality with Kachin, Kya, Karen, Mon, Rakhine, and Shan. They are one of the ethnic races of Burma." End quote. As noted in the IIMM Rohingya report, Prime Minister U Nu's administration had Rohingya government ministers and parliamentary secretaries. There was a Rohingya Students' Association in the University of Rangoon. And in 1961, there was a Rohingya language radio broadcast on the public radio station of the Burma Broadcasting Service. In the early years after Burma's independence, there was an armed insurgency of Rohingya who sought to separate northern Rakhine State from Burma and join what was then called East Pakistan, or present-day Bangladesh. The Burmese army quashed that insurrection, whose fighters were referred to as Mujahideen. In July 1961, during the so-called Mujahid insurgent surrender ceremony, Burma's Vice Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, Brigadier General Aung Gyi, delivered a speech identifying the Rohingya as an ethnic group in Burma. His speech is at Annex 143 of the memorial. In relevant part, General Aung Gyi said the following, quote, "In central Burma, there are people who hold the view that people in this region are not Thai Yin Tha, or ethnic group native to the Union of Burma. These are false views. I want to openly and publicly tell you this. We consider the Rohingya people of Mayu district an ethnic minority integral to the Union of Burma. Let me be very precise about this. Those of you here ought to view yourselves as an ethnic minority of Burma. Only then will peace prevail in this region and in this country of ours." End quote. He went on to recognize the legitimate grievances of the Rohingya that had led to the insurgent movement in the first place, and declared that the persecution of the past was ending. Quote, "They said the Mujahideen rebellion broke out because of religious persecution. They said there was economic persecution. They said there was racial persecution. Yes, they are correct, as these rationales and explanations were true to a certain degree before. But that was the past. There is no more racial persecution, for we have emphatically and categorically recognized Rohingyas as an ethnic minority, making efforts for the progress and development of the Rohingya ethnic minority." End quote. Myanmar quotes from his speech in its rejoinder, using its own translation, to argue that General Aung Gyi referred to the Rohingya as the same ethnic group as existed across the border in present-day Bangladesh, and not as a distinct ethnic group in Myanmar. I will address the argument about the distinctiveness of the group shortly, but what is important is that Myanmar concedes that General Aung Gyi used the term Rohingya to refer to the Muslim majority population of present-day northern Rakhine State. Unfortunately, the commitment to recognition and inclusion and an end to persecution referred to in these speeches, the very same demands that the Rohingya have to this very day, did not hold true. Those who sought to exclude the Rohingya from the country soon regained power. In 1962, a military coup ousted the civilian government, and there began a long process of systematic persecution and discrimination against and exclusion of the Rohingya, extending and enlarging over the next several decades. This eventually culminated in the genocidal clearance operations of 2016 to 2018. Ms. Pasipanocha will go into further detail on the history of discrimination as one of the indicators of Myanmar's genocidal intent. I will now address why the Rohingya are plainly a protected group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Article 2 defines genocide as any of the acts listed therein that are, quote, committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. As articulated in Bosnia v. Serbia, the court has defined a group for purposes of the Genocide Convention as, quote, a collection of people who have a particular group identity, end quote, that is defined by, quote, positive characteristics, national, ethnical, racial, or religious, end quote, which can be identified through a, quote, combined subjective-objective approach, end quote. The key objective factors include distinguishing well-established or immutable characteristics, such as language, religion, citizenship, or hereditary physical characteristics. The key subjective factors include self-identification, perceived characteristics, and socio-historic context. Myanmar argues that these ethnical, racial, or religious characteristics must be such that the group is, quote, distinct from the rest of the world's population. There is no basis in the court's jurisprudence for this extreme position, which seems more motivated by Myanmar's desire to deny the existence of the Rohingya group than an effort to reasonably address the court's standard for defining the group under the convention. There is also no basis in the court's jurisprudence to apply, as Myanmar seeks to do, a high standard of proof applicable to findings of genocide to the identification of the group at issue. As the court made clear in Bosnia, all that is necessary is that the positive and objective characteristics of the group are such that it would enable the court to, quote, have in mind the identity of the group against which genocide may be considered to have been committed, end quote. The identity of the Rohingya group is clear. First, the Rohingya are rightly considered as an ethnical group given their language, culture, self-identification, and their identification as such by Myanmar and the United Nations. Clear evidence indicates that the Rohingya group speaks a common language, namely the Rohingya language. As noted, British and German ethnographic documentation from 1799, 1811, and 1815 refer to the Rohingya language as being spoken by Rohingya in Burma. Furthermore, a 2018 report from the NGO Translators Without Borders found that among Rohingya refugees surveyed, all, quote, said that they speak Rohingya, with 99% of them saying it is their primary language at home, end quote. That it is the, quote, only spoken language that all Rohingya refugees understand and prefer, end quote. Myanmar has not challenged this evidence. Rather, Myanmar argues that the Gambia has not established that the Rohingya speak a language not shared by others in the Chittagong division in Bangladesh. That is not something that the Gambia is required to prove. The fact that the Rohingya share this specific language is a positive characteristic that helps to establish their identity as an ethnical group. As the Gambia noted in the memorial, the Rohingya language is related to the Chittagonian dialect of Bangla and considered by anthropologist Dr. Pras Freeman to be a different dialect, one that the Rohingya view as central to their ethnic identity. Even Myanmar has noted the Rohingya's shared language in defining the group for purposes of its first report on implementation of the court's order on provisional measures. In that document, Myanmar noted that members of the group, quote, speak an Indo-European tongue, which is a variant of or is closely related to the Chittagonian dialect, end quote. The Rohingya also share a common culture. As discussed in the memorial, the Rohingya's shared culture includes communal organization around a mosque or group of mosques, an emphasis on family and community, and their own music, art, poetry, and foods. Myanmar again argues that these cultural characteristics may also be common to communities in Bangladesh, but that does not rebut the fact that these shared cultural characteristics allow for the identification of the Rohingya as an ethnical group in Myanmar. The subjective factor of self-identification is also highly relevant to the characterization of the Rohingya as an ethnical group. As noted, ethnographical reports from the 18th and 19th centuries document their historic self-identification as Rohingya. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported that Rohingya Muslims self-identify as a distinct ethnic group with their own language and culture, and claim a long-standing connection to Rakhine State. Other authoritative UN reports, like the reports of the UN Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, have found that the Rohingya self-identify as such. As noted in the memorial, 85% of the Rohingya self-identified as such during Myanmar's 2013 Inquiry Commission on Sectarian Violence. And as noted earlier in my presentation, an estimated 1.1 million people were recorded as unenumerated in Myanmar's 2014 census because Myanmar did not allow them to self-identify as Rohingya in that census. Furthermore, Myanmar itself clearly recognized the Rohingya as an ethnic group in its early years after independence. The speeches of Prime Minister U Nu in 1954 and General Aung Gyi in 1961 clearly acknowledged and accepted the Rohingya identity as such. Moreover, Myanmar's long-standing discriminatory treatment of the Rohingya, which will be discussed in further detail by Ms. Pasipanochka, also confirms their distinct existence as a particular group in Myanmar. Finally, the international identification of the Rohingya as a distinct ethnic group by the United Nations and other states is a relevant subjective factor. In addition to the reporting by the UN entities noted above, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has identified the Rohingya as a group since 1978. UN bodies like the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council have consistently referred to the Rohingya group by that name in dozens of UN resolutions, specifically addressing concerns over the treatment of the Rohingya, as have the UN Special Rapporteurs on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. And as noted in the Gambia's reply, the courts of several states, including Japan, France, and Australia, have all found persecution against the Rohingya based on their identity as such. All of these objective and subjective factors indicate that the Rohingya are widely recognized as an ethnical group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Second, the Rohingya are also a distinct group of Muslims for purposes of the Genocide Convention. It is not disputed that the Rohingya are predominantly Muslim. In fact, Myanmar consistently refers to the Rohingya by their religious identity as Muslims as a means of identifying them as a group. For example, as the court may recall, Myanmar's first agent in this case, the former state councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, referred to the Rohingya as, quote, Muslims living in Rakhine State during the oral proceedings on provisional measures. And in the first report on implementation of the court's order on provisional measures, Myanmar referred to the group as one of two, quote, sizable Muslim communities, end quote, in Rakhine State, the other being Muslims of the Kaman ethnicity. The historical record also confirms the close association of the Rohingya with Islam. Myanmar notes in its rejoinder that the British colonial census data refers to Arakan Mohammedans, that is, Muslims of Arakan, the territory that is now Rakhine State, which is one way in which the term Rohingya itself could be defined. The Muslim faith identity of the Rohingya group is central to their otherization and dehumanization in Myanmar, key parts of the genocidal process to which they have been and are being subjected. Several discriminatory laws, like restrictions on marriage and on the number of children couples could have, were explicitly targeted against Muslims, as you will hear in the presentation later today by Ms. Pasipanochka. And the pervasive hate speech that targeted the Rohingya often focused on the threat that they, as Muslims, allegedly posed to Myanmar's Buddhist majority population. You will also hear more on that later today. Myanmar argues that if there are non-Muslim Rohingya, then it cannot be considered as a religious group under the convention. But religion is not an immutable characteristic. So individuals who identify ethnically as Rohingya could be non-Muslim. They can convert to another religion or no longer believe in any religion. Many consider the small Hindu population in northern Rakhine State to be part of the Rohingya ethnic group. Indeed, in its counter-memorial, Myanmar states, "Not all Bengalis in northern Rakhine State are Muslim. A small minority are Hindu or Christian." Nonetheless, when the Gambia is referring to the Rohingya group, it is referring to that group based in part on its primary identity as a group of Muslims. Myanmar further argues that the Rohingya cannot be a separate religious group because they are not distinct religiously from the many Muslims in neighboring Bangladesh. But the existence of Muslims in Bangladesh is not relevant to defining a group in Myanmar for purposes of the Convention. As we know from the Court's decision in Bosnia, a geographical limitation combined with a religious identity can be used to define a group for purposes of the Convention. For all these reasons, the Rohingya are a religious group within the meaning of Article 2 of the Convention. Finally, the Rohingya are also a racial group under the Convention. A racial group can be defined by objective characteristics like physical traits, as well as subjective factors like their socio-historic context and their perception by Myanmar authorities. Myanmar is a deeply race-based country. Citizenship is defined by belonging to 8 so-called national races. Myanmar's 135 officially recognized ethnic groups all fall within one of these 8 races. Despite the early recognition of the Rohingya as an ethnic group by Burma's political and military leaders, the Rohingya have since been excluded from these national races. Thus, Myanmar considers them to be a different race from these national races, which is effectively an admission that they are a distinct racial group. In describing the Rohingya, Myanmar officials have been documented as referring to their darker skin color and their being of, quote, Bengali stock. Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya, which includes severe restrictions on movement and lack of access to healthcare, education, and livelihoods, is implemented by recognition of members of the group based on their physical appearance. The reality of this race-based treatment of the Rohingya, combined with their long history of persecution, constitutes a subjective factor allowing for their treatment as a racial group in Myanmar for purposes of the Convention. Myanmar once again argues that these factors do not establish the Rohingya as a race separate from people of Bengali origin, but that is not what matters. So long as the objective and subjective characteristics allow the court to identify the group at issue in Myanmar, the Rohingya can be considered as a racial group for purposes of the Convention. In conclusion, Mr. President, the relevant objective and subjective factors establish without the shadow of a doubt that the Rohingya of Myanmar are an ethnical, racial, and/or racial group for purposes of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Court, for your kind attention. Mr. Reichler will give the Gambia's next presentation, but this concludes the Gambia's presentations for the morning session.